Welcome back. Richard, it's good to see you.
Morning. It's good to see you.
Good morning. Now, we have a tough topic today, a topic that we hear about often, especially because here in our practice, we do a lot of work with families. And of course, if you're doing work with families, you're doing work with families who have been successful in staying together and all of that. But then we have other families who, for one reason or another, the family ended up breaking up, and the parents didn't stay together, and they're divorced and are starting new lives. But we're going to talk about an issue that has gained a lot of notoriety, I guess, called Parental Alienation Syndrome.
Right. Yeah. Notoriety and confusion and anxiety and all sorts of emotions. Right.
Right.
It's called parental alienation. And there's some people make a distinction between parental alienation and parental alienation syndrome.
Right.
We'll talk about that as we get into things. But yeah, this is a difficult topic, parental alienation.
It is, and it's obviously it comes up a lot when we're dealing with divorces and separations and trying to do custody evaluations and those kinds of things. And it's often used, it's thrown around a lot in cases where, if a child becomes more attached to one parent than the other, or if they're, as we'll talk about, especially in cases where there's been a history of domestic violence or something like that, parental alienation is something that can happen. We're going to try to dispel some myths. We're going to talk about parental alienation syndrome over the next 3 weeks. Today, we're just going to kind of talk about what it is and some signs and characteristics of it.
Right.
Next week, we're going to talk about the effects of parental alienation on the child as well as the alienated parent. And then the third week, we're going to talk about where do we go from there? How do we prevent it? How do we identify and then heal from it? So we got a lot to talk about with this.
We do. It's a pretty broad topic, and again, it's one of those topics that we really don't know a great deal about. There hasn't been a lot of research. There are a lot of opinions, but the problem is at the level of the family system, it's a very destructive force, and
Absolutely,
it's been very difficult to sort of capture the essence of this problem, and that's part of what we want to talk about in weeks 2 and 3.
Right.
Podcast is what are those difficulties and why this is such a difficult topic to manage for psychologists and attorneys.
Absolutely, and I think we should begin with the idea that it is a perplexing and difficult problem.
Right.
It's not a real diagnosis. It's not in the diagnostic manual. This is it reminds me of like the word sanity. We often think of, is the person sane if a person is insane? We think of that oftentimes as a clinical term, but it's a very legal term. Sanity has a very legal definition, and it's something used in the legal process. We really don't use it in mental health at all. Parental alienation isn't a mental illness. It's not a mental health diagnosis. It's not a medical diagnosis of any kind. This is something that's leans more towards the legal side of things. But again, none of the diagnostic organizations like American Psychiatric Association, they don't identify it as an actual diagnosis.
Correct. It's you're right. It's more of a legal term than a mental condition.
Right.
Although there's an association between mental conditions and parental alienation, but again, we'll talk about that in another part of the project, part of the podcast.
Right.
So parental alienation typically doesn't only occur during a divorce. It also occurs in intact families.
Right.
And in fact, the alienation may begin long before the divorce, where one or the other parent is sort of setting the stage for eventual alienation. But what parental alienation um, means is that either consciously or unconsciously, one parent seeks to win the allegiance of the children by turning them against the other parent.
Right.
And we understand why that happens. People get divorced. Typically, they don't like each other very much, and they will do what they can to gain some control over the situation. One of the most important differences, one of the most important distinctions we should make, and this will be helpful for listeners, is the difference between alienation and estrangement.
Right.
Estrangement is a warranted rejection of a parent. Typically, it would occur with some sort of abuse,
Right.
physical, emotional, verbal, sexual abuse, where a child has a reason to be separated
Right.
or alienated from the parent. Alienation is unwarranted rejection. There
Right.
is really no reason for this to occur. And the most obvious example of that is that a child can have a perfectly amenable, normal, close relationship with a parent, and then the divorce occurs, and suddenly they turn against the parent.
Right.
And it's that unwarranted rejection that we refer to as alienation.
Right.
So as we go through the topic, people will think, well, what if the parent should be? What if the parent should be alienated? If there's a reason, well, if there's a reason, then we would call that estrangement.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So it's an important distinction.
Right. And so yes, that's a very important distinction, and something one of the first things that we look at if we're looking into parental alienation as a suspected event that's happening. But let's think about what parental alienation is, and I think there's two ways to look at it.
Right.
One way is to look at it from the perspective of what the parent is doing, the
Right.
parent who is attempting to alienate the child. And then the other way to look at it is the response of the child.
Right.
So, again, when we think about it, what we're really talking about is sort of at the most basic level. It's when a child, for perhaps unjustifiable reasons, like you said, it's not really warranted, but the child aligns himself or herself with one of the parent.
Right.
And one of the really important aspects is that the child also starts to express some rejection and some hatred toward the other parent.
Right. Right.
The parent who is being alienated.
Right.
And that's a really important piece, right?
Yeah, because you're not. The thing to keep in mind with alienation is that it is a two-part phenomenon. And the
Right.
first part is what changes the child makes. So in a clinical setting, like when we do parent coordination, or we do custody evaluations, or we do parenting groups, what we're talking about here is we're working with the child because the child has now aligned himself with one parent and is expressing hatred or rejection against the other. So that's one issue that at a clinical level you have to deal with.
Right.
So that's one part of parental alienation. But the other part is it's the effort by the aligned parent, by the parent who's doing the alienating.
Right. And that parent, what they're doing is they're attempting to manipulate the child's belief and perceptions, and many times really working to distort or erase or alter some of the child's positive memories of the other parent to make them more negative. One of the articles that's listed in the show notes is from Psychology Today and talks about that, that part of the reason it's so difficult is that you have the parent who's attempting to alienate doing this, sort of working to change the child's memories, which, let's be honest, isn't always very difficult to do. I mean, it's not real difficult to change a child's memories, especially depending on the age of the child. Just a few words here or there. If you ever watch the movie Inside Out, there are lots of examples in that movie where the main character, looks back and thinks about, some of these, some of her memories as really negative, and just slightly changing the perspective, and it turns into a really positive memory. And so you can go, and it can go back and forth.
Right. That's very, very common that children will come in, even children as young as 8 or 9 years old, and all they'll talk about are the 2 or 3 difficult moments that they had with the
Mhm.
parent. Well,
Mhm.
there's 8 years of memories there.
Right.
They come in and they just recount 1 or 2 episodes.
Right.
When you talk to the parent, they say, "Wait a minute, we went on camping trips. We went to Disney World. You
Right.
know, we used to. I was her softball coach. I was her soccer coach."
Right.
And so the parent has all of these fond memories, and the child is just focusing on a couple. But when the aligned to parent, um, it's very easy for the alienating parent to distort or erase those prominent positive memories just by focusing on the negative one. Oh, you remember when your dad did it? Oh, you remember when your dad said this? You know, your dad
Right.
always had a bad temper. Well, no, dad didn't always have a bad temper.
Right.
And so, but that's the two-part process that you're dealing with. You're dealing with a child who has selective memories and distorted memories, and they're dealing with a parent who is actively seeking to change the child's beliefs and perceptions about the alienated parent.
Right. So when we think about how often this happens, I
Mhm.
think it's the numbers are impressive because, and not impressive in a positive way.
Right.
It's impressive because when you think about, you know, about 50%, right? Or so, maybe a little bit about more than 50% of marriages end in divorce. And so
Divorce, right.
you have a good percentage of kids who come from broken homes.
Hmm.
Um, you get this, and then you think about this phenomenon happening, and the numbers are remarkable. About 22 million parents have an alienated relationship with their child, with a
Right.
child.
Right.
22 million
Hmm.
parents have that alienated relationship. So what that does is that leads us to about 4 million children who are alienated from their parents.
Right. Right.
That's
Yeah,
a
because
remarkable number.
yeah, it's those are hard numbers to get. Well, the child count is hard to get because frequently children don't realize it, or they're not accessed, or parents don't want to give you access. So there's a little bit of a difference in the numbers. But 4 million children that we know of, that's probably a minimum. That's probably a minimal estimate, are alienated from their parents. And to put that in context, in some larger context, that's 3 times as many children as those who have autism. Okay, and we know that autism is increasing in frequency. It's a fairly common diagnosis now. And this is 3 times as many
Right.
children are alienated. So it's a significant problem.
Right.
It's especially significant in the effects that it has on children, and not only the an alienated parent, but eventually on the alienating parent. So it has
Absolutely.
effects on all three.
Right. And and parental alienation syndrome isn't new. It's been around.
Mhm.
It was first coined by Richard Gardner in 1985,
Right.
and Gardner identified 8 symptoms.
Hmm.
Um, and we'll go through those quick because we want to get to sort of the signs to let you know what we know. Some more updated information as far as what we look for.
Right.
But when Gardner was talking about it, he said, one of the things is that the child constantly and unfairly criticizes the other parent.
Right.
And it's that, like we've been talking about, sort of that campaign against the other parents to keep putting them down and have those, really emphasize negative memories, even turn
Hmm.
positive memories into negative memories. But it's just constantly happening from the child.
Yeah, and that doesn't take a lot of effort, or it doesn't have to be vitriolic. It can be. It often is mean spirited. But the parent can just say, "Well, I don't know. I don't know why your dad didn't call today. Maybe he's busy, or maybe he's out doing fun stuff with his friends." And so you can in a nuanced way
Right.
start to shift the child's perception. But it's a campaign to denigrate the other parent,
Mhm.
either subtly or not so subtly. Um, and it's a very effective because it's a constant drip, 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 and
Right.
you're getting these negative messages from the parent. And most children would assume that a parent is telling them the truth.
Right.
So whatever I'm hearing, it must be, why would my mother lie to me? Why would my father lie to me?
Right, absolutely. And so what happens is when we meet with the child, another symptom is that the child has very little evidence. The examples are very specific,
Hmm.
um, and they refer to really isolated individual times in which something happened. They will provide one specific episode where
Right.
mom had a really bad temper and dropped a plate or something because she was angry, and that becomes the sole focus. But there's no other evidence. There's no other supporting information to support their reasoning.
Right. And that's one of the important things, is that you start to get this selective memory and very specific examples. And that's a second, when you talk to the children and you say to them, okay, explain what happened, explain, and they give one or two examples, and you're sitting there thinking, oh goodness, I've done that with my own children. I'm guilty of that too. But it's a very selective use of episodes and incidents.
Right. Another symptom that Gardner talked about is that um, the child's perspective of the parents are unwavering. So the alienated parent, it's all negative. That other parent, everything that the child talks about them is negative, and there's no ambivalence about it. There's no uncertainty about it. It's all negative.
And it's really hard to get the child to shift, because
Yeah.
when you talk to them, and you in a clinical setting, and you're talking to the child, and you say, well, wait, let's think about that for a moment, and you start to talk to them, but what you're actually doing is, it's, in a sense, the child is stuck between the therapist and the parent.
Mhm.
What, this is what my mother told me, this is what my father told me, and
Right.
you're giving me this other story. Who's the child going to believe? They're likely to believe the other parent. So it's very difficult to move the child from that very hardened position. There's no ambivalence here.
Right.
But when a child gets alienated, it is complete, total alienation. There's nothing nuanced about it.
Right. Yeah. So the child believes and claims that all of the perspectives that they have are
Right.
their own conclusions that they drew from their own independent thinking. When we know that a lot of that was fueled by the alienating parent.
Right. Yeah.
But just as their negative perspective of the other parent is unwavering and not mixed at all. It's all
Right.
negative. The support and perspective of the other parent, the parent that they have aligned with,
Hmm.
is also unwavering, and it's all supportive. It's all
Right.
positive.
That's right.
You can't. It's really difficult to get a child in that situation to say anything at all negative
Right.
about the parent who has done the alienation.
And I think about that a lot with these kids, because when you think about it, the child is aligning with one of the parents. Once the child has aligned with one parent, especially when you get this active rejection, total accurate rejection, and hatred, animosity to the other parent, now the child is one parent away from being an orphan.
Right.
And so, if you think about it from the child's perspective, they've already pushed one parent out of their lives.
Mhm.
That means they only have one parent. And might I add, they've not only pushed the alienated parent out, they've probably pushed the parent's entire family out.
Right.
Okay.
That whole side of the
So
family.
now they have one parent and a few relatives. And if that parent would die or disappear, now the child has no parents.
Right.
So they're going to invest heavily
Hmm.
in the alienating parent. So
Right.
once a child makes that decision, and you're right, the fourth characteristic is, these kids think they're making this decision independently,
Right.
and in most cases they're not.
Right.
They've been programmed a certain way. If they've been alienated, by definition, they've been programmed.
Right.
And so once they make the decision to push one parent to separate that parent, now they're one parent away from being an orphan.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
And there really is no, another characteristic is that there really is no guilt
No.
felt by the child at all about mistreating the alienated parent.
That was the
There's
most
no hesitation.
astonishing things to
Yeah,
me, was when you talk to these kids and they have no remorse, there's no guilt. I mean, here's a parent who's been supportive there for the child's entire life,
right.
and now they're saying that person. No, I mean, I've had 12-year-old kids say, "My father no longer exists. I don't have a father."
And they don't really hesitate to even say that right in front of the parent.
No, they have. They will.
Yeah,
I have. You no longer exist. We no longer need you.
yeah.
There's nothing that you bring to our life. We no longer need you. And children will say that directly to the alienated parent.
Right. Yeah. And when the child talks, again, another characteristic that when the child talks to either someone like us in a clinical setting, or even to other adults, the child uses terms and phrases that certainly seem very much more adult language type of words than what you would expect from the child.
Right.
And again, referring to things that maybe never happened, or sometimes they talk about things as though they were there and it happened and the child wasn't even present.
Right.
And they're talking about this and sometimes talking about it in great detail, and they weren't even there.
Yeah, and you'll ask them, then what happened? Well, I don't know, but I wasn't there, but I heard about it.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And but then again, unwavering in the perspective that it absolutely happened just as they're describing.
That's right. Right.
So,
yeah.
And then as you said, the alienation tends to extend beyond the specific parent to the entire that side of the family. So Gardner talked about all of these, and and one of the things that he came back later and said is that while the child seems to have this really strong bond to the alienating parent, the parent that they have aligned to, there is often some evidence that the child had a really good bond with the parent that's now been alienated.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a history of the child really being close to the other parent, the parent that they have now been alienated from. So it's really a devastating experience for the child.
Right. Yeah, Gardner added that later, that you should have this previous bond. There was a time when the alienated parent and the children did have a strong bond. And the second thing is that children who are alienated have a very difficult time transitioning from one parent to the other. They don't want to go. They come up with excuses, and that's the other thing. If they're willing to go, then they're not alienated.
Right.
So he added these two things later.
Right. So we talked about a few things that we see from the child. Let's talk about a few things that we'll see from the parent who's doing the alienating.
Right.
And one of the things that we see is that the parent who's trying to persuade the child or alienate the child from the other parent, one of the things they do is they provide the child with a lot of unnecessary and oftentimes very inappropriate relational details. So they may talk to the child about affairs or domestic violence that maybe even didn't happen, but they'll talk to the child about some of these things in an effort to persuade the child to be against the other parent.
Right. Right. And so we have this list of these signs of parental alienation, and so the first one is convincing the children that the targeted parent no longer likes them or wants to be with them. That's very, very common, okay, among alienating parents, is that all you have to do is say, well, I don't know, I guess your dad doesn't want to be, the parents are divorcing,
right?
Not the parents and the child.
Right.
But the alienating parent will include the children in the divorce.
Yeah.
Say, he's leaving us. No, he's not leaving all of you. This is simply a divorce.
Right.
You're not divorcing the children.
Right. Oh, go ahead.
No, so that's one thing that you frequently see, is that the children become part of the divorce.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I was mentioning a minute ago that you have the parent making a lot of negative comments and giving a lot of inappropriate information to the child. And in light of that, what the parent will then do is blame the other parent
Right.
for the divorce and why their family isn't together anymore, and
Right.
those kinds of things. And it's and again, oftentimes inappropriately, blaming them for things or claiming that they did things that either isn't true or is from maybe from their perspective, but
Hmm.
certainly not completely accurate,
Right.
or certainly not appropriate for the child to hear.
Right. Yeah. So a second sign of parental alienation is restricting the time that the child can spend with the other parent. We see this all the time. You deal with it in custody evaluations.
Right.
You must deal with it in every custody evaluation, is where one parent will seek to severely limit the time that the child can spend with the other parent.
Hmm.
And they'll use the courts and they'll use attorneys to limit the time, and then frequently blame the alienated parent for making the decision when
Right.
it's not their decision at all. The alienated parent wants to spend more time, but the alienating parent is severely restricting the time.
Right.
And they'll do it even they'll even defy court orders. Everybody has a divorce decree
Right.
which lists the visitation, the hours of visitation, and
Absolutely.
I have many parents who simply defy a court order,
Yeah.
and they dare the court system to do anything about it.
Yeah, they really push the envelope there, and sometimes even sometimes related to that, you'll hear about them making false accusations about abuse or neglect.
That's right. Hmm.
A lot of times we'll see repeated reports to like Child Protective Services or Departments of Children and Families and things like
Right.
that, false, or to the police even, making these false allegations or false
Hmm.
accusations of abuse or neglect against the other parent.
Right. Right. And the last one, I think one of the most insidious, is parents will either consciously or unconsciously, and I think it's probably consciously, they will withhold affection or they'll threaten punishment
Hmm.
if the child expresses positive. I mean, I've heard parents say to their children, I mean, I don't hear it, but the children will report that the mother will say, well, and they'll make these they're not veiled threats, they're open threats,
Right.
that if the child expresses any positive feelings about the absent parent, that the child is going to have some consequences,
Right.
either emotional or physical consequences for even expressing positive emotions. And so that's a very direct way of shutting down that
Hmm.
relationship that your child might even want to have with the other parent. There's nothing. Again, we said there's no ambivalence here. This is
Right.
this is total destruction.
Yeah, and one of the ways that you see it early on is, when the child is going to go visit the other parent, the alienating parent will prime them
Hmm.
by saying things like, well, look, if you have any problems, if mommy starts to get really angry, or
Right.
make sure you call me right away, or
Right.
daddy doesn't mean it when he says those things. So,
Mhm.
again,
Right.
they can be very subtle, but oftentimes little seeds are planted
Right.
that then mature into, a lot of perspectives and beliefs that aren't really accurate or true. So
Right. Yeah. Parents will say, here's this cell phone now. Don't tell, and you
yeah,
call me if there's any problem.
yeah,
Well,
hide it in your bag, don't let daddy know that it's there.
right. You're planting problem seeds, and everything that happens, the child is calling the alienating parent to report on everything that happened. Well, just let me know. Then the child returns from the alienating parent, and they have this debriefing session where they go through everything that happened, and then the alienating parent will make judgments
Right.
about what the child is reporting.
Right.
So it's
Absolutely.
just this ongoing, almost constant effort to separate children from parents.
Yeah, it's really difficult. And so as we're wrapping up this week, it's important to say that parental alienation is real. It's not. I think that we believe that it happens a little bit more often than it does
Mhm.
happen.
Mhm.
I think that children certainly have a tendency to say what it is they believe the parent that they are with wants them to say. So it's not at all uncommon for a kid to go from, having spent time at mom's house, then go to dad's house. And if dad says, what did you do this? Oh, nothing really. We didn't do anything. No, I didn't really have fun. Despite the fact that they could have gone to Disney. Yeah, we went to Disney, but it was really hot and it wasn't very much fun. And then when they go back to mom's, they do the same thing about dad's house. And so there is it, and certainly that's not healthy. That's not good for the child, but that's not parental alienation either. That's just the child sort of aligning with whatever parent they're with, and kind of going back and forth. Because as you said at the beginning, if the child connects with each parent whenever the child is with that parent, that's not parental alienation.
Right.
One of the parents could be trying it. They could be trying to alienate, but it's not working if the child is not changing some of those perspectives.
Right. Exactly.
So, all right. So that's it for this week. Next week, we're going to talk about some of the effects of parental alienation syndrome on the child as well as the parent. And then we'll wrap it up on the third week, talking about where do we go from there?
Prevention and healing. Right.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, that's it for today. Until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid.